Alright, welcome back to the channel, guys. Today I want to talk to you about side decking. As a top player in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, this is one of the most frequent questions that I've been asked throughout my course of playing the game, and now that I am a content creator, it is easier to answer this question to everyone or to be able to direct them to this video for future questions like this one. I actually just had this come up at my locals last Thursday. I was playing against one of the people who attends almost all the time. We're good friends now. And after our match, he was like, yeah, I don't think I sided correctly. Like the next game, I think it was only 2 games, but I remember him saying something about he didn't know if he should be siding something in against me or not, and if it was actually the right thing to do. And it happens more often than you think, where after a game, you'll look at what each player had, like you'll look at their set cards or what's in their hand, and it's just something that they sided in that's kind of dead or not as good as you might have thought it would be. And that's why I want to go over this. So I have these 7 main points to discuss. The first is 2 ways to approach side decking and general philosophy. Then we have don't touch your engine, avoid oversighting, high variance cards, simple side decks, complicated side decks, and transformative side decks. So when it comes to the 2 ways to approach side decking, I think that you should be going for either A, covering a bad matchup, or B, covering what your opponent is going to side against you. Those are the 2 main things that you want to think about when you're building your side deck. So when it comes to covering a bad matchup, right? Let's look at RBET2, Rodnak's deck from that. He sided GB Hunter. Now, again, the Glad Beast Frog matchup is absolutely terrible, and there is a good reason why at the time he felt like GB Hunter was necessary. I'm sure that having lost or tested that matchup, if you've ever played it, it is really not fun. And GB Hunter is very narrow, but this is the type of thing that sometimes you need to do in order to beat a really bad matchup. Like sometimes the matchup is so bad that you have to put in these extremely narrow cards that are literally only for one deck. Another example of this, I think, was Carpath at Deck Devastators 3. He sided Electric Virus for just dragons because Kawaki Miro Drago is an FTK/OTK against fairies. Especially the build that he was playing where lights and darks were the entire center of it, and it cuts off like all of his deck. So he sided triple Electric Virus because it's just that bad, and lo and behold, in the finals he played against dragons, and a guy did actually summon Kawaki Miro Drago, and he outed it with Electric Virus, so it panned out perfectly. But yeah, that is something that you just have to have the foresight to know, like this deck can't beat this deck without a strong side deck card. And so here's an example with the GB Hunter. I think there's another one here. So Cameron Saunders also sided Mirror of Oaths. Again, extremely narrow, right? The card is only good against Glad Beast. It doesn't come in against any other matchup. And again, there are like 26 different decks in Edison format off the top of my head from my tier list video. There are actually more than that, but those are the ones that I just could put in the tiers and felt like were decent. But yeah, Mirror of Oaths only covers one of them, like literally one. You could argue maybe you could put it against Cat, but like that's a rant. But yeah, Mirror of Oaths is very narrow, but when your matchup is that bad, sometimes you just have to be super narrow-minded like that and go, yep, I am just putting this card in because this matchup is that atrocious. When it comes to covering what your opponent is going to side against you, though, I think Hydro Pump's deck from Peak of the Beak 2 is a good example of how to side against what people are going to put against you. So everyone knows that Blackwings, being one of the best decks in the format, people side in Consecrated Light, and every single monster that he sided is an out to Consecrated Light. They're all light and water and earth, and just not dark monsters. So in games 2 and 3, if he's playing against a deck that he knows will side in Consecrated Light, he can put in cards that are not only good against that deck, but they also out what you're going to side against him. And that is a very strong thing to do in Edison format. You always have to be thinking about, what are people going to put in against me, and how can I play around that? So same thing with Deck Devastation Virus against frogs. If you're a frog player, and you know that your opponent is probably going to put in something like Deck Devastation Virus, you can actually side out some of your weaker monsters for stuff like Vanity's Fiends and Cyber Dragons, so that way you're less susceptible to getting destroyed by Deck Devastation Virus. As you can see here, I have 40 cards that I think are very common in Edison format right now at the time of this recording that people tend to side deck. This is not everything. Obviously, there's no way that I could fit everything into one video. However, I felt like these were 40 of the most common ones that you'll see a lot when you look through the topping deck list and what they're siding. Also, I am not going to go through each and every one of these cards, their strengths and weaknesses. However, I can actually do that if you guys are interested in a video where I just discuss everything you see on screen here one by one. That could be a video idea for sure. Just let me know in the comments if that's something that you're interested in, and I'll for sure put that together for you. You guys know I love to talk and I could definitely do it, but it will take a very long time and that could be its own video. So I won't do that here, but this is just kind of the 40 cards that I think most people tend to side. Now, the first two, the Cyber Dragon and DD Crow, I feel like most decks in Edison format start off with these two cards, and that's for a good reason. Cyber Dragon, not only is it a high tempo card, there's nothing quite like it in the format. It's a special summon. If you're going second, it's really good. It's obviously good against things like machines, but it also covers matchups like Glad Beast and Hero Beat. Any deck that's kind of a beatdown deck or can get outpaced by just having a big monster come out of nowhere, Cyber Dragon is probably going to be good against, and it has a good attack stat against decks like Hero Beat, Glad Beast, stuff like that. So that's why a lot of people side this card. And now that the Machina control deck is popular and just out here doing the absolute most, Cyber Dragon has become even more relevant than it has been. Now, the opposite is kind of true for DD Crow. I actually feel like DD Crow is getting worse and worse as the format goes on. So when I first got an Edison format last year at the beginning of 2022, DD Crow was in every side deck, and that's because decks like Zombies and I guess standard Light Sworn, even weird decks like Flamvel or Quick Draw, they were a lot more prevalent, and DD Crow was thriving, and is obviously good against things like Frogs too and weird Norlaris decks. But a lot of those decks have kind of fallen out of favor. Mainly Quick Draw isn't really played as much. Like, you can go through an entire tournament and not see a single Quick Draw deck, whereas I don't think the case can be said about something like, let's say, Frogs or Light Sworn variants like Christia Sworn and stuff like that. But I think even more importantly than that, DD Crow just isn't as good as it used to be, because the decks that you can side it against, it kind of comes off as a high variance card in a weird way, and that's one of the points that we'll talk about later on. But yeah, these are the two most common side deck cards in Edison format, and then everything else here is just like, again, things that I've seen people side deck over the course of my year playing this format, and I think that all of them have their pros and cons. I would also like to preface this discussion by saying that there is a caveat to almost everything, so nothing is absolute. So a lot of things that you're going to hear me say, there may be an asterisk next to them, because there's, again, nothing is absolute in Yu-Gi-Oh! Every time I'm teaching like my friend Stango or my friend Jalen about how Yu-Gi-Oh! Works in general, I always have to say, this is what you want to do probably 99% of the time, but then there are instances where this scenario comes up and it's not the correct thing to do. So I just want to say that way I don't get anyone like, hey, I did exactly what you said and it ended up losing me the game. It's like, well, for one, sometimes doing the right thing will lose you the game, because that's how Yu-Gi-Oh! Works. It's a game of variance, so that can just happen. But also, if you follow something by the book every single time, sometimes that is just a wrong thing to do. So I just want to kind of give that before we get into it. Okay, so the other point that I want to discuss here is going first versus going second. When you are going first, this is where cards like Trap Dust Shoot, Bottomless Trap Hole, those cards are a lot better when you're going first. And then when you're going second, cards like Cyber Dragon, Breaker the Magical Warrior, those cards get a lot better when you're going second. And I think sometimes people don't realize that they should be siding out things when you're going second that don't really serve you, because they just are too slow. And Edison has actually gotten a lot faster than what people, I think, originally thought. Like, now that decks like Christie Sworn and Machina Control are in it, and then the Frog decks and stuff, the games are actually really fast. Not to mention Value Turbo, Zombies, and Blackwings in general are just really fast decks, and all of those are S tier. But yeah, when you're going second, something like Gold Sarcophagus isn't as good. Waiting 2 turns is easier to do when you're going first, but when you are going second, you open up Gold Sark. Not only are you already a turn behind on tempo, your opponent probably has a set monster, or they've set up with Swap Frog, or they've summoned the Glad Beast, or they've gotten a Strato Search or something. Now you are searching out a card that, sure, you may be able to analyze the situation now because your opponent went first and say, oh, I need Heavy Storm because he set 3 back row. Or, oh, I'm going to get, you know, Dark Arm Dragon because my hand has a lot of darks in it. But again, the games have gotten a lot faster. And I won't say that you will not get to your 2 turns, because I think that for the most part you will. But sometimes, even though you got to seed the card from Gold Sark, it can be too late. So it's a card that I often tend to side out if I'm going second against a deck that I feel like can actually put me in a bad situation in 2 turns. Like they can really take your life points really, really low, or just establish a board presence like Glad Beast, for example. Glad Beast might not kill you in 2 turns, but then the game can just be over in those 2 turns that you're waiting. So I think Gold Sark really sucks in a matchup like that. That's just an example. I don't think that you should be siding for matchups that are already in your favor. So that's another one of the points that I wanted to talk about here. Sometimes I see people side for things that their deck naturally deals with and beats with its own engine. A good example of this is Gladiator Beast. So Gladiator Beast has a good matchup against frogs, and I don't think that you need to side like Dimensional Fisher for frogs. I think if you're siding D-Fisher, you're more so siding that card for Lightsworn. If you side that in against the frog deck, you can actually just get monarched out the game, and sometimes they'll just Ryza the D-Fisher attack over your monster, and now you're drawing a D-Fisher. Whereas against Lightsworn, like that card, outside of Lila, it will actually serve you because their whole deck is milling it down, whereas a lot of the modern frog decks, they actually can play without their graveyard. It's very strange, but like you would think that, oh, for sure Treeborn Frog is the main point of the deck, and that is true. But now with the hero packages and all the other different engines that frogs can actually run now, the deck can get away with a lot in games 2 and 3 because they also side in Soul Exchange. So they can use your monsters against you, which they often will, especially if they're playing against Glad Beast. I think Soul Exchange is amazing against that deck. But they can use Infernal Prodigy, Cyber Dragons, and things like that to get their tributes off. So if if your only protection or your only answer is a D-Fisher against that deck, then it can go really, really south for you. And to the original point, I think Glad Beast already deals with the frog deck as far as banishing cards because you have Rediari in your deck, right? Like that's pretty much in the main deck of every frog deck, and that perfectly deals with your issues there as far as graveyard stuff goes. And then Chariot deals with everything else, so you don't have to really side cards against the frog deck. Like I don't really think that Glad Beast need to side DD Crow against frogs. I can understand why you would want to, but I just feel like when you are losing with Glad Beast, it's because you can't defend yourself, not because you couldn't stop your opponent's engine. It's just because you couldn't defend yourself from some big monster. Basically saying that if your opponent establishes a big monster, your DD Crow doesn't help you get out of that at all. And I think that that is really problematic. So that's one of the reasons why I try to avoid siding for matchups that are already in my favor. That's the overarching point there. I also don't think that you should be siding Chimera Tech Fortress Dragon. I know that there are times where it's really, really hard to fit it in your extra deck, but I promise you, you can just make space. Side decking is so tight right now. Edison has so many decks. I think when I did my tier list, there were like 26 decks in there, and a lot of them are actually competitively viable. Despite the fact that, yes, there's an S tier of decks that almost every good player agrees on, there is just a lot of decks that you can play against, and you want to be able to cover several matchups, and having something like Chimera Tech in your extra deck is just better than having it in your side deck. So I, just as a rule, do not like to put Chimera Tech Fortress Dragon in my side deck. I'd rather just put it in my actual extra deck and call it a day and use all 15 of my slots for cards that go in my main deck. The cards you see next to it, Mirror of Oaths, Swallow Flip, and Tuner Scheme, these are cards that have fallen from grace. They're kind of old school. When I was looking through the actual top deck list from SJC Edison in 2010, the thing that I saw was some cards that are no longer sided at all. I don't really see any of these cards sided in modern Edison. Now, I did see Mirror of Oaths sided last year at RBET 2, but even after that, I've never seen it again in any tournament, any deck dev stage or anything. Like this card is completely was sided once. I'm not even sure if when it was all said and done, if the person who sided this wanted to even keep it in their side deck afterwards. I feel like the answer to that is a hard no. Like I don't think that he wanted to keep this in his side deck, and if he could probably go back and change, it's like, okay, yeah, this did not really serve me. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't, but the fact that I haven't seen it in anyone's side deck since then leads me to believe that this was just like a one-off idea to try, and it didn't work out. But yeah, back at the actual SJC Edison, I think that you would see cards like this and Swallow Flip and Tuner Scheme. I don't think I've ever seen Tuner Scheme flip in Edison format at all. Like I don't think I've ever seen this card actually resolve. And it's crazy because when I read it, it actually looks like it could be a really good card, but then I think that it's so situational that a lot of people don't want to take that risk. So it's in the category of high variance cards, which again, we'll talk about those later. Okay, for the next topic, don't touch your engine. So this is something that happens all the time. And I actually played against Stango at the Philly Regional last year. We were playing Blackwings versus Zombies. So he was on Zombies and I won game 1. And then game 2, he basically bricked and I just attacked him a bunch of times with a Shura until he lost. And after the game, I was like, well, what did you have? Because you didn't do anything the whole game. And he revealed his hand. And I was like, oh, okay, you actually bricked. But then he showed me what he sided out. And he ended up siding out Pyramid Turtle, Spirit Reaper, Mystic Tomato, and something else. And I looked at it, I was like, oh, well, here's the issue. You sided out some of your engine. You actually sided out the cards that make your deck do what it's supposed to do. And that is something that a lot of people do by accident without realizing it. So when you look at this deck list in front of you, you have this Beast Mode deck, 5th place RBET 4. And you see the top 2 rows. In all honesty, those monsters, I really wouldn't touch those when I'm side decking. The only ones that I think you can side out are Spirit Reaper if you're playing against specifically a deck that tramples. So Blackwings is the main deck that I can think about that tramples, and Spirit Reaper does not do well in that matchup at all, especially because they have a searchable Gale, and Gale just outs it really easily for a +1. You don't want that interaction at all. And then having a 2800 trample monster is super annoying. Also just Bora, Sirocco, and that whole thing. Spirit Reaper is not very good in the Blackwing matchup. But outside of that, I do not side out Spirit Reaper. It's a godsend against things like Archlord Christia, Absolute Zero, and stuff like that, where you can stall out the game until you can deal with those cards properly. Caius is another card that I would say you can side out, especially when you're on 3 of it, because when you're going second, Caius is just not as good. Obviously, your opponent gets the chance to Caius you first or set up their tempo plays first. So Caius is really, really slow going second, and I tend to side it out. Not all of them, but I tend to side 1 or 2 out if I'm going second. And then Gale is like the niche tuner in this deck. It isn't necessary. The Divas and the Plague do most of the heavy lifting, and then Gale's just kind of there because not only is making a 7 sometimes really good, like Black Rose Dragon or Armor Master, but it can have another effect to just, you know, beat over something like a Stardust or whatever, and that can be really good. But there are a lot of matchups where you just don't need Gale. Like, Gale is not at all the main point of the zombie deck, and there are better cards that you could put in a lot of matchups. As you can see, he sided Kaiku and Thunder King, Cyber Dragon, Siroccos, and Crow, and so you're probably going to want to remove some of the monsters that I just mentioned there, but I don't think you want to touch the Tomatoes, the Pyramid Turtles, the Goblin Zombies, obviously, the Mizuki, the Plague, the Zombie Master. That's like your main engine when you think about the zombie deck. So other cards that I would consider siding out in this deck are, and this all is matchup dependent, of course, but for example, if you're playing against frogs, right, one of the first things I take out is my Heavy Storm, because who the hell are you Heavy Storming in that matchup? Yourself? You're not going to activate Heavy Storm against a frog deck and actually get any value out of it. It's either going to be something chainable like Threatening Roar, Wabaku, Raigeki Break, Wing Blast, something like that. And so there's no real reason why you should have Heavy Storm in. I could see reasons why you would want to keep in Mystical Space Typhoon, but I tend to side that out as well. Like, I get it. You could catch an in-phase Threatening Roar and OTK them or something like that, but I think the risk of it just being dead the entire game is so high that I personally would not want to keep in my MST against a deck like Frogs. And this also, what I'm saying right now, applies to Lightsworn as well. I don't like keeping in Heavy Storm or MST against Lightsworn unless I think that they're going to decree me if my deck can be decreed. So if you're playing Blackwings, a deck that typically runs a lot of traps, I think it makes sense to keep in your MST against Lightsworn because they are going to put a decree against you to go with their Consecrated Light, and that's like an OTK. So you need to kind of have that MST as an out, but I would still take out my Heavy Storm because, again, it is more likely that you're going to be the one with back row than them. So it's not worth keeping in Heavy Storm and MST in that matchup. So those are cards that are easy to side out. Book of Moon is also matchup dependent. Like, it's not good against everything across the board. So I can see this card being sided out a lot. And I tend to look at Call It a Hornet and Return, but whenever I have the choice between siding out one of those, it's always Call It a Hornet as opposed to Return, because you have to understand that people are going to side in things like DD Crow against you, right? So Return is not only a game-ending card where you can just win the game with that one card on its own, but it also doesn't play into what people are going to side against you. If you go for Call It a Hornet and your opponent crows you, it kind of sucks. Whereas you expect to kind of get crowed anyway, or soul released or whatever. highest bottomless D-Prisoned. So Return is just a game-ending card, whereas Call It a Haunted is more like a support card. It isn't nearly as powerful as Return. So it's a card, again, I tend to side that out, especially going second, going back to that whole idea. Going second, it's just not very good to have Call It a Haunted, and you can get out tempo pretty easily. Another example of not touching your engine. So you see that top row right there, that top row of Frogs in Karina's third place deck, that should not be touched. Those 10 Frogs right there, they should stay in your deck every single game that you play. You should not be touching those. I think it's a bit more obvious when you look at a Frog deck, which is why I started with the Zombie deck, because I think zombies are a bit trickier. But when you look at the Frog deck, that top row, you can't touch that. The things that you can touch, however, are the Uni-Frog. You don't need it in every matchup. If your opponent obviously is playing something that doesn't have a lot of back row, Lightsworn, a Frog Mirror match, stuff like that, you don't need Uni-Frog. Easy to side that card out. Mobius, same exact logic as Uni-Frog. And then Ryza is not good in every matchup. For example, Ryza is a high variance card against something like Lightsworn. If you are facing a Judgment Dragon, Ryza absolutely sucks, right? Like it's awful. If it's the early game and they're trying to set up a YGO or something like that, Ryza can be very good, but it's very risky to keep it in, and that's where things like Vanity's Fiend just come in over cards like the Mobius and the 2 Ryzas here, I would say. Other things that you don't want to really touch, the Gores, Tragodia, Double Battle Fader, the Threatening Roars, Mirror Force, those are your defense cards. Frogs needs those cards to survive. It is a very powerful deck the longer the game goes on. It's most vulnerable in the beginning when it's setting up, but once it gets set up, it is absolutely ridiculous, especially because once it thins the deck out, it starts top decking bombs, and yeah, those bombs can literally be game ending on their own. So that being said, you don't want to side out your defense. You can side out, again, the Monarchs that don't really do anything, the Mobius, the Ryzas, the Uni-Frog, Junk Synchron. You can go down on copies of that. I don't think that you, in games 2 and 3, where people put in Pulling the Rug and DD Crow and things like that against you, that Junk Synchron carries as much weight. He gets a lot worse when people have in those specific cards. It's just another card to get Pulling the Rug. It's also a card that can get deck devastated. So I don't really like that about it either. And you have to consider these things when you're playing against certain matchups. And like, okay, if I side these out, there are less things for me to get hit by when they flip deck devastation virus. So just consider that when you're side decking. I could actually do this for basically every deck in the format, and again, if you're interested in that type of thing, let me know in the comments, and I can just go through general ideas when side decking. But as I said earlier, Gold Sarcophagus, same thing. Like if you're going second, this card isn't very good. It can be very, very slow. And Frogs, I would say that it can probably get away with it a little bit better than something like Diva Hero or Dragons, just because it plays so much defense. Like it's kind of hard to OTK a Frog deck that's playing Battle Faders, Threatening Roars, and all that stuff. Like it can be really difficult, and it always seems like this deck has Gores, not literally, but the way it plays naturally, right? So Summon Swap Frog, Sentry Roar, and Bounce to my hand, pass. It looks like your opponent has Gores just because they're not committing anything to the field, but that's just how the deck plays. So your opponent is always thinking about Gores when they're playing against Frogs, and that's like a really strong advantage of it. So Gold Sark has a higher opportunity of getting you the card that you were looking for in 2 turns without your opponent necessarily rushing you down, because they might rush into a Gores they can't handle, and that can just be really valuable. But yeah, if I had to side things out, I'm definitely looking at the Gold Sark as one of the cards that will get sided out, depending on the matchup and how fast I think it is, and if I feel like I can wait. Same thing with Scapegoat. Scapegoat it's a blowout card for sure. It's very, very powerful, but it's also in that high variance thing where, you know, if you don't open with it, it can kind of suck, and it takes a while for you to completely set up the Scapegoat play. Like you have to have it set, then you have to end phase it, then you have to next turn summon substitute and go through the whole thing, and that can just be a lot. So again, games 2 and 3, it can just be a little bit harder when people are putting in hardcore hate against your deck. So that's an easy side for this deck as well. Okay, so the next topic is avoid oversighting. Now, this one is kind of hard to see, because when you lose to a deck really bad, or you feel like you lose to a deck all the time, like you go to your locals and you play against a guy and they pretty much always beat you with the deck that they're using, and you just feel like this matchup is so bad that I'm going to side 10 cards against it, but then you end up still losing. That's probably because you oversighted. There is no right or wrong number of cards to side against a deck, but I feel like if I had to just say an arbitrary number, I feel like if you're siding more than like 5 or 6 cards against any given deck, something is probably wrong. Like it usually shouldn't take that many cards to make your matchup better. And once you start getting to the point where you're putting in legit 10 plus cards against one deck, your side deck is probably not good at that point, or you're just overdoing it. And I imagine you're cutting into your engine at that point as well. And that's the dangerous thing that people don't realize they're doing. Do not take out your engine cards for side deck cards. Like I said, there's a caveat to that, but at the end of the day, you don't want to touch your main engine when you're siding, and oversighting tends to lead to you touching your main engine. So the second you start looking at your monsters in your deck that are the main crux of your strategy, and you're like, you know what, I'm going to start taking these out, you're already messing up, because the point of you playing your zombie deck or your frog deck or your Glabbeast deck was that you can actually draw frogs and Glabbeasts and stuff like that. So try not to actually overside. The next thing is high variance cards. So high variance cards tend to be in my top 10 most overrated cards in Edison format video. If you haven't seen that, check it out. But a good example of that is Nobleman of Crossout and Soul Release. So these cards, they're not necessarily bad by any means, right? Like Nobleman is very good when you hit a Hamster or a Ryko. Soul Release is very good when your Christia Sworn opponent has, like, you know, 4 fairies in a grave or 4 names in a grave, and you can just hit them and knock them back to turn 1, back to the Stone Ages, so that they have to do all the setting up again, and it probably isn't enough time and they just lose the game. I get that these cards are very powerful sometimes, but that's why they're in the high variance thing, because they're also awful at times. Soul Release, if you draw it after the fact, it's really, really bad. That's just an obvious statement, right? Like if your opponent gets to 4 fairies on their turn and drops Christia, it's too late for Soul Release. This card is no longer good. Same thing with Judgment Dragon. If Judgment Dragon comes out, it is too late to Soul Release and remove the 4 names that they required to summon it in the first place. It doesn't help you to deal with the problem once the problem is already there, and you don't know how fast it's going to happen, which really, really sucks about these cards, but that's just one of the things that makes them inconsistent, and I personally hate inconsistencies like that. With Crossout, like, sure, you can set a Crossout against a deck like Zombies because they tend to set their Goblin Zombies and Tomatoes and Pyramid Turtles, but there are also games where that deck can literally play face up for 1, which is what I do games 2 and 3 with Zombies. Like, I don't like really setting my monsters if I think that there's a chance that I'll get crossed out and it's the only one I have. Like, if I open up Goblin Zombie as my only real monster, I'm not setting that shit, because it getting crossed out or errand is probably going to be the end of the game. There's really not anything your opponent can do to stop a face-up Goblin Zombie anyway. Like, what the hell are you going to do to it? So if it's set, it just leaves it more vulnerable to cards like this. And then when the game is over and the zombie player wins, they're like, oh, what'd you have? And it's like, oh, I had Crossout. It's like, yeah, Crossout is okay in the beginning of the game, but as the game goes on, zombies, they go hardcore face-up with a ton of synchros in 1 turn out of nowhere, and then you're just looking at this dead-ass Crossout. So this is a good example of something that is really, really high variance. I would say the same thing is true for cards like My Body as a Shield. I understand why this card is cited, but it definitely falls in the category of high variance because 1, the life point cost of it is very steep. 1,500 matters a lot. You're probably going to want to side this against something like Blackwings, but the problem with that is Blackwings is a damage-based deck, so Blackwings can knock you below 1,500 really quickly, and this card will be dead, but you want to have it against Deck Devastation Virus, and you also want to have it against Icarus Attack. So I understand why it's cited, but again, high variance there. System Down, same thing. I would consider this a high variance card. It does destroy machines, but you can also just have it after the fact. Your opponent just does a shit ton of damage to you already, and then you have System Down, and it's either dead because of the life point cost, or they're just poking you with like a gear frame or just a fortress, and you're going to go 1-for-1 with it, which is not what you really wanted to do when you put this card in. You wanted to hit multiple things and really decimate the deck, and then that doesn't always happen, which really, really sucks, and it can be, you know, high variance. Kaiku is another one. Kaiku is a card that a lot of people, when they do side it, they only side 1 copy of it. I think it's because they understand that this is a high variance card. His attack stat is not the best. He has to inflict battle damage, which, again, not the easiest thing to do. And just overall, a pretty vulnerable card. When he is good, though, he's insane. Like, against Value Turbo, Kaiku is insane. He stops your opponent if they go Greffer, send Value, and Sirocco to the grave, and they don't actually use them immediately. You can just summon this guy against the Greffer and attack over it, and they can't do anything about it, really. So that is a really strong interaction. It's like, yeah, that's insane when that happens, and that probably just outright wins you the game. But then there are times where the Value Turbo player will just have, you know, a field of monsters because they can absolutely OD on the field in one turn. And then you have Kaiko in your hand like, well, damn, this really sucks here. I wish I had this before he decided to banish for value and then activate Burial and do it again. And the same can even be said about Deck Devastation Virus. Like, this card is amazing, don't get me wrong. There are a lot of times when it outright wins the game, but there are also times when it doesn't do enough. And it really, really sucks when it doesn't do enough because you will give up 2 cards to use this, right? You give it the Deck Devastation Virus itself, and you give up whatever monster you tribute it. So already you're in for 2 cards. If it doesn't hit at least 2 of your opponent's cards, it's already bad, right? If it just hits one thing, you're already neg. And sure, you get the information, you get to see what they draw, and that's really good. But depending on the situation, that sometimes isn't enough. So Deck Devastation Virus is one of those cards where, as good as it is pretty high variance, and that's why I kind of include it in my list of, you know, high variance cards in Edison format. Now, when I was talking about DD Crow earlier, I said that I would bring it up again when we talk about high variance cards, and that's because DD Crow, when you think about decks like Diva Hero and even Frog decks, having 1 Crow against them just isn't it, especially Diva Hero. I think it's very apparent with Diva Hero and also Value Turbo. So when you sign a DD Crow against those decks, they can actually just do a lot without needing to use their graveyard the way you think they would. For example, I played against a guy, and this video will be uploaded to YouTube soon, but I played against a guy the other night. I was using Value Turbo, and when the game was over, he had DD Crow. And I think he already crowed me once in that game. When I used Grepher's effect to send value and send Sirocco, and I went activate value, he went activate DD Crow, banish a value. So now I just have a Sirocco in the grave. But the problem was, Grepher didn't die. He didn't kill the Grepher, so next turn, I drew, and I activated Dark Grepher again, and this time I pitched a Sirocco to send another value to grave. So now I am back to the point where I was about to be last turn, but not only did I do 1700 damage in a turn where I summoned it and he crowed me and I couldn't summon my 2200 vanilla, but now I'm also, the Grepher's still there, you're still getting beat down, and I still get my 4,000 points of damage on the following turn because the issue's still there. I could have also just drawn Armageddonite, and it would have been the exact same thing, right? Like, Armageddonite would correct the situation of DD Crow, so you crow the value that one turn, but then on the next turn I just summon it and send another guy. Against things like Diva Hero, DD Crow really sucks if they have multiple warders and multiple heroes, and so sometimes if the Diva Hero player is like really good and you know what they're doing, they'll make it where Crow can't even really be used against them when they activate Miracle Fusion, right? Because that's what you're really going for, is you're trying to DD Crow their Miracle Fusion. And they just go, okay, that's what you're trying to do? I'm going to make sure that when I play this card, I have double water and double hero. And they could do that in multiple ways. They don't necessarily need them to all be in the graveyard. They can go summon a hero before activating Miracle Fusion, just in case, like Special Infernal Prodigy, and then activate Miracle Fusion. So they only have 1 hero in the grave, but now they have 1 on the field too, and they have 2 warders in the grave. This allows them to perfectly play around DD Crow, and this happens all the time, okay? It feels really bad when you have DD Crow against that deck, and it makes me not even want to side it against that deck because of how high variance it is. I've lost many games with DD Crow in my hand against Value Turbo and against Diva Hero. So while it can be decent, it's also just super high variance. Where I think it does shine though, is I think that DD Crow is still very, very good against zombies. Because when zombies make their big push, it always involves Plague Spreader and Mizuki, right? Like those cards are going to at some point be relevant for their push, and DD Crow stops both of them. So you definitely want to have DD Crow against those. And I would always recommend siding DD Crow against zombies. But when it comes to decks like Diva Hero, Value Turbo, and I think even to a degree now, like Frogs, it's weird. If you have DD Crow on your side deck, yes, I agree with you putting it in against Frogs, no question, right? Like you should definitely just put it in if it's already in your side deck. But I won't say to build your deck with DD Crow in it because of Frogs. I think there are better cards to side against Frogs than DD Crow. Those being Masquerade Strip, Pulling the Rug, yes, stuff like that. So as the format progresses, Crow has just gotten less and less good. And I guess to expand upon the Frog thing a little bit more and why I think that it's not what it used to be, because I mentioned it a little earlier, but I'll go over it again. They side in Soul Exchange, and they a lot of times play things like Infernal Prodigy, or they side in Cyber Dragon, and these give them other ways to tribute that don't involve Treeborn Frog. Now, don't get me wrong, the crux of the deck is still Treeborn Frog. Like that is the main thing that the deck is trying to do, is abuse Treeborn Frog over and over and over again. And so Crow does a good job of stopping that, but it won't stop the actual pressure of Monarchs. So if that's your goal, that's not it. You probably are looking for something like Mask or Restrict or Pulling a Rug to deal with the big threats and the Monarchs, in which case you're just better off. All right, so point number 5, the simple side deck. So if side decking is really, really difficult for you, there is a type of side deck that I love, and it has existed for a very, very long time, and it's actually still being done in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! So this is Rawneck's deck from RBET1 Season 2. As you can see, he's only siding 5 different cards. I absolutely love this. I've done it a couple times in some of my YCS tops where I just could not decide on a bunch of different cards to side, so I said, I'll just side these 5 cards and I'll just do 3 of all of them. And it honestly works like a charm. It makes siding super simple, right? You don't have to think about it too much. You're like, these are the cards that I'm going to side. These cover my matchups perfectly. And it's also, if your deck is playing a lot of 3-ofs, you can kind of see exactly what to take out to put them in. For example, if he plays against Blackwings, right? He's going to side in those 3 Sirocco's for the 3 Turbo Rockets, because Turbo Rocket gets hit by Deck Devastation Virus. It's also not the best against a deck like Blackwings that is a damage-based deck, so it loses a lot of its luster when you're trying to go for like your crash into the monster and then all that stuff. It's just not very good in that scenario. Sirocco, on the other hand, doesn't get hit by Deck Devastation Virus. It kind of blows the Blackwing deck out because it will always beat their monsters, and it can do a shit ton of damage. So it covers a lot of things, and it's an easy 3-for-3 swap right there. Another thing that isn't as good, as I already mentioned, so you see Marshmallons in this deck, and I talked about Spirit Reaper earlier. Spirit Reaper is not good against Blackwings, and neither is Marshmallon. It is a card that can sit there and get you trampled on by Bora and Armwing, and so you probably want to side that out, as well as something like Ryza in certain matchups. I think is also a card that you would side out for the Vanity's Fiends. Like Ryza isn't good against Lightsworn or Christia Sworn necessarily. I mean, it can be, right? If their start is really slow, it can be, but why risk it? Why not just go for the card that's going to be good more often than not in Vanity's Fiend, so you can easily side out the double Ryza there. And I think Marshmallow also sucks against Lightsworn because they have a searchable Aaron, and even if they mill it, they could bring it back with like Lumen and stuff like that. So yeah, Marshmallow is just kind of weird. It also gets Celestia and stuff. There's a lot of reasons that Marshmallow wouldn't be good in that matchup. And so it's something that you can easily side out. So double Rise of Marshmallow can go out for triple Vanity's Fiend. And then DD Crow for the mirror match. I'm assuming that, you know, I think that DD Crow is only really good if you see 2 of it against Frogs. So the best chance of doing that is to actually side 3 copies. Also, decks like Zombies OTK this deck, and it doesn't feel good when you know you probably would have won if the game went longer, but they just did a crazy push in 1 turn, made Brionic and Goyo and all that stuff. And so DD Crow helps against that deck. And Book of Moon deals with everything that's super problematic against the Frog deck, like Christia and Vanity's Fiend and Fossil Dyna. Then we have 3 Dust Tornado, super simple again, straight to the point. You're dealing with Mask Restrict and possible pulling the rugs. And so yeah, just 5 different cards. And I said that this is something that's being done in Modern as well, because Jeff Jones, one of the best players, and the actual person who won SJC Edison, the whole format, is based on that event. In his most recent top, he actually sided 5 different cards in his Kashtira deck. So there's 3 Ibly, 3 Book of Moon, 3 Enemy Controller, 3 Forbidden Droplet, and 3 Evenly Matched. And yeah, that strategy has been applied, you know, 13 years ago when Edison first happened. And even now, like there are people who sided just 5 different cards back then, because I actually sadly played through Edison format and a lot of the older Yu-Gi-Oh formats, and I've known about like a lot of these different types of side decks for forever. But yeah, it's cool to see that something that's happening in modern Edison and also just modern Yu-Gi-Oh as a whole is applicable in topping tournaments in both of them. Like both formats have the same ideas happening where people are just like, I'm going to side 5 different cards and just do 3 of each. And as you notice, the Kashtira deck has a lot of 3-ofs as well. So it's very, very easy to do this simple side deck when you have a deck that already sides 3-of, 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 and you're just going to side in 3-of, 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 3-of. As for a complicated side deck, this is 0.6. So complicated side decks are like with Steven Silverman, 3-time YCS champion. He topped the PS5 tournament a little while ago, and he sided 11 1-ofs. This is something that he's done pretty much through all of his tops, and he has a lot of them. He loves siding a bunch of 1-ofs. He does not like going triplicate of every card. Pretty much never does that. And that is because he believes in just having high variance, highly powerful cards in his side deck and calling it a day. So if you look here, you see Morphing Jar, Spirit Reaper, Giant Trunate, MST, Mind Crush, Dust Shoot, Return, those cards are all limited to 1. The only cards that are not limited to 1 that he sides 1 of are Soul Exchange, Soul Release, and Cyber Dragon. But even then, like, he just doesn't like siding too many multiples unless it's super important. So Decree makes sense because this deck's engine is stronger than almost every deck in the format's engine. Therefore, if it gets to play the game through Decree, it will just beat you no matter what you're playing with, because its engine is just going to be stronger than yours. Like, literally, I think Lightsworn has the strongest engine. I think it is by far the strongest, most oppressive engine. Frogs is probably a close second, but I think that, like, if both decks get to play, the Lightsworn deck is just too much, especially Christia Sworn, right? Like, think about it. If they resolve their namesake, Christia, it's probably over for every deck. And so, yeah, this deck wants to force its engine through, therefore Decree makes sense as a 2 of, and then Consecrated Light, Blackwings is just, you know, a really tough matchup sometimes if you get rushed down, and Consecrated Light, it also goes with your engine, so I'm not surprised there. But yeah, 11 1-ofs. This is complicated because what the hell are you even side out for these cards, right? Like, it's not easy to do a side deck like this, and I don't recommend it if you're not someone who's well versed and really skilled in Edison format already. If I wanted to discuss what I think he sides out in this deck, it would definitely be, again, Goldsart going second, Hamster going second. I know that he's not a big fan of Raikos and Hamsters, which is why the original deck list played 3 copies of Raiko, 3 copies of Hamster. He opted to only main a total of 3 of those combined. So he's not a big fan of setting monsters, and we come from the same school in that regard. Like, both of us do not like setting monsters like that, so I get why he went down on those. I could easily see him pulling out Hamster and 1 Raiko when he's going second, because those cards are super slow, and it doesn't feel good to set up monster when your opponent's already playing the game. I imagine that Foolish Burial and Wolf come out sometimes too, because those cards are pretty inconsistent overall, especially Wolf. If you're playing in certain matchups, Tragodia and Gores don't really make sense. For example, against Glabbeast, those cards are just not good at all. Like, I don't like Gores or Tragodia against Glabbeast, and that is actually what he lost to in Top Cut. But yeah, those cards I imagine got sided out for other things pretty often, depending on the matchup. You could also make arguments that Call It a Hornet isn't the best card and could be really slow, so that's something that gets sided out, I would think. And I would also say that when this deck does side, right, so he has 11 1-of cards in here. When this deck does side, it isn't putting in a lot. Remember what I said about not oversighting? You don't need much to cover your matchups. If you're playing against the mirror match, you side in Soul Exchange and probably Oppression, Dust Shoot, that's it. You don't really need more than that for the mirror match. You could arguably put in Mind Crush as well. So I would say Mind Crush, Dust Shoot, Oppression, and Soul Exchange are like the cards you would put in a mirror match. And then if you're going second, you probably put in Soul Release as well, just because, you know, you have the highest chance to stop them after they go first, Soul Recharge, do a bunch of stuff, and then you're just like, all right, I'm gonna Soul Release you, then I'm gonna try to play the game after that. But you don't want to put in too much in most matchups with this deck. The engine is so tight, and some decks really can't side deck. I think that's another thing to talk about, is like with the complicated side decks, you have to realize when certain decks can't really side too many cards. Another good example of this is Dragon Turbo. That deck can't really touch too much of its engine. I guess I'll pull up a deck list. So let's look at Pro Storm's deck from RBET3. This is Dragon Turbo. And a lot of these cards are mandatory that you keep in. Like the whole top 2 rows, you pretty much have to keep in most of those cards, if not all of them, just because that is your actual engine. Like all of the monsters there, you need essentially in your deck to either obviously resolve something like Future Fusion, but also just because you have a very specific goal. It's to draw through your deck, and you need all of the Tuner Dragons for Cards of Continents. You need the 8 stars for trade-in. You need the Red Eyes, because that's the whole point. Prime Material Dragon protects your field, and I would say that overall, that's just one of the best cards in the deck. Gores for protection, Tragodia for protection. Clear Vice, this is a card that you can side out, and the only reason that it's in there is because of things like Kalut and Honest. If you want to OTK through them, it helps with that a lot. But other than that, I think that everything else is pretty much mandatory. Quackmere or Drago, if you're playing against something like Frogs, you don't need that card, of course, because it doesn't really stop anything. But yeah, for the most part, you can't really touch any of those cards. And if you thought about the cards that you can actually side out here, I would say things like Magical Stone Excavation gets a lot worse. If your opponent sees that you're on that, they might side in DD Crow, and it would really suck to lose 3 cards to a DD Crow. So that card gets a lot worse in games 2 and 3. Some people like to side out Upstart Goblin as well, just because it is basically saying your deck is going to be 37 cards. So if you need to put in multiple cards, Upstart Goblin is one of the cards that people tend to side out. I don't I don't really like the idea of doing that though. I feel like if you put Upstart Goblin in your deck, the point of it was to make your deck really efficient and thinner. And so if you're going to side deck and just take the upstarts out every time, that doesn't seem correct to me, but I have seen it done a lot, and I don't really agree with doing that, because at that point I feel like you should just not be playing Upstart Goblin. Pot of Avarice is something else that you don't need 2 copies of games 2 and 3. Again, you don't know if your opponent's going to put in DD Crow, and I've seen it all in Edison format. You just can't say with 100% certainty that your opponent's not going to do something against you, which kind of sucks, but that's just how it is. So I've played with Dragon Turbo a good amount, especially last year, just to test it out. And yeah, while I don't think that DD Crow is good against the deck by any stretch, it can really hurt you when people put it in anyway, because they're like, well, I don't have anything to side against this deck, so I might as well put in my Crows, and then they just have it against your Pot of Avarice or your Magical Stone Activation, specifically Stone, because that's not a 1-for-1. Like, at least with Avarice, it's a 1-for-1, but with Stone, it's like, dear God, I just lost so many cards. But yeah, this is an example of a deck that has a pretty complicated side decking scheme, because it's hard to touch any of it. And the same thing is true about a deck like Nerlaris. If you look at this Hopeless Dragon deck, this is another deck that you really can't touch the engine too much. Like, all of the monsters in this deck, all 24 of them, you basically need to fulfill some kind of goal of the deck. You need a lot of dark monsters because of Dark Creator. You need the 8 stars for trade-in. You need Nerlaris and Phantom of Chaoses, because that's kind of like the point of the deck, to reset you guys and then to go into a top deck mode with a strong graveyard. I would argue that Upstart Goblin is needed too, because this deck, when it draws Future Fusion, is probably the strongest Future Fusion deck in the format. And so it comes down to a few things that you can actually touch. Again, Gold Sarcophagus is one of the cards that you can take out. You can take out 1 Red Eyes Wyvern. I tend to do that when I play a deck like this, because, you know, it is one of the bricks of the deck, like, that you just don't really need. Grepher is way better as a normal summon, so if you draw Red Eyes Wyvern, it really, really sucks. And depending on the matchup, things like Cold Wave aren't as good, Giant Trunade, stuff like that, but there isn't really much you can do. Outside of those cards, like, it's very, very tight. Like, this is a very, very tight engine that you don't want to affect too much. So some decks just have that thing where they can't side out too much, they can't really transform too much. And that kind of, you know, it kind of sucks when it happens, but yeah, I just wanted to make sure I gave you guys an example of a really high level, complicated side deck that I think is for advanced players. And if you just want to keep things simple, definitely just go with the, you know, 5 different cards and 3 copies of each. You could also do, one of my favorite types of side decks is just doing a ton of 2-ofs. So you just do 7 different cards that you play 2 copies of in your side deck, and then just 1 copy of something. For example, in this hybrid Blackwing deck, you can see I side literally 2 of everything. 2 Cybers, 2 Crows, 2 Snowmen, 2 Dust, 2 Duck Devi, 2 Pulling, 2 Trap Hole, and then 1 Light Mirror. So just a bunch of 2-ofs. I think that this is also a pretty simple side deck. Instead of 5 different cards, it's 7 different cards, and then you just have your 1 copy of something. Or you could just do 3 copies of 1 card too and just call it a day and really have 7 different cards. But yeah, I think that this is a relatively simple side deck. It just has more different things, because I think that it can be hard for certain decks to just do 5 different cards overall. Okay, the last thing that I want to talk about is transformative side decks. Now, you don't see this very often, but this is something that very, very old school Yu-Gi-Oh players knew about back in the day. And I always thought it was so cool when a deck game 1 would play a certain strategy, and then it would just side into something completely different. So I think in the old days, there was a deck like Baboon Burn, and then it would just side deck out the Burn engine into like Rat Toolbox or something, or it would just go into like Monarchs, or just something completely different. This is a deck from RBET2 by Marcus 1999, and it is a Lightsworn deck in game 1. It's very close to Twilight though, because it plays Caius, it plays Sorcerer, and then it has for darks, you know, Gores, Necrogarden, and Plague Spreader, and Tragodia. But yeah, this is essentially a Lightsworn deck, and it sides into Vayu Turbo, basically. Like, it takes out a lot of the Lightsworn engine, and all 15 of these cards get sided in, which is really cool. So I remember I actually tested this deck out for a while, and when it side decks, it takes out like Garoth, Lumina, all of the Wolves, the Judgment Dragons, the Celestia, the Honest, the Solar Recharges, and it replaces all of those cards that are weak to Light Imprisoning Mirror with just dark monsters and a beatdown strategy, and it blends together so well. Like, this deck is actually really good. It's one of the decks that made me respect Lightsworn in general, because seeing this and knowing that most people saw Light Mirror, I think when I was actually watching the stream for RBET2, This deck was on stream and the opponent had Light Mirror face down when they lost. They were getting attacked by an Armageddon Knight for pretty much the entire game. And I was wondering, like, what are those 3 dead back row that aren't doing anything? And then when the game was over, they were Light Imprisoning Mirrors. I think 2 of them were actually at the end of the game. But yeah, this is a strategy that can catch people off guard. You win game 1 with Lightsworn because Lightsworn is such a strong engine and just a casino deck that can high roll your opponent out the game. And then they're like, all right, I'm going to put in my Soul Releases, my DD Crows, my Light Mirrors, and you side into Value Turbo. And now that stuff doesn't really do anything. Like Light Mirror doesn't do a single thing. DD Crow is a lot worse against Value Turbo, as I already said. And Soul Release, again, not very good against Value Turbo, especially if your opponent realizes that in games 2 and 3, instead of summoning Grepher and pitching and not using it immediately, you might as well use it immediately because of things like Kaiku and Soul Release. So yeah, really cool deck. And I think that transformative side decks, they aren't easy to do. And oftentimes you do sacrifice something for this. You're sacrificing blowout cards against certain matchups, like you're pulling the rugs and your consecrated lights, right? Like there's none of that in this side deck. And those cards are really, really strong against the decks that you put them in against. But you don't have room for that type of thing. But what you are doing here is you're tricking your opponent into siding in cards that are just not good against what you're about to be playing in games 2 and 3. And then game 3 is, if it gets to game 3, right? If it even gets to game 3, it's really tricky because then they don't know what the hell you're going to be on. They don't know what you're going to do. They don't know if you're going to go back to Lightsworn, if you're going to go back to the value deck. It's very complicated and it can make them take cards out of their side deck. And it's really a coin flip. And the person playing the transformative side deck can just do whatever one they want at a whim. They can just choose what deck they want to be playing in game 3 at a complete whim. And you're sitting there looking at your side deck like, all right, well, to be safe, I don't think I want to keep this Soul Release in because it might be Value Turbo again and I might just get beat the hell down with a Soul Release in my hand, or top deck a Soul Release when the field is already established, which really, really sucks. In closing, I hope that this really helps some of you guys to understand side decking better and to come up with some ideas on how you want to build your side deck, whether you want to go with the simple side deck where you just play 5 different cards, or you do 7 different cards with just 2 of each copy. Or if you want to do a complicated side deck because you feel like you could take the challenge of that and a bunch of one-ofs that your opponent can't really predict because you're not on a ton of them, you're just on like random one-ofs all throughout. If that's your thing, you can try that out. Or if you are a madman and you figure out some way to do a transformative side deck, that can be a lot of fun too and competitively viable, which I really appreciate. But yeah, if you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know if you want me to go through every single one of these cards and their pros and cons in a separate video, and I'll be glad to do that for you. And yeah, I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.